This evening, July 29th, 1969, Marian Lindeman and I, Gerda Mortensen, sitting on their delightful porch at Parker's Lake, are going to start talking about my background and my experience over many years as we worked together at Augsburg College. I came there as a Dean of Women in 1923, and Marian came as a teacher of French and other subjects in 1926. That started a long lifetime friendship which has kept on growing more meaningful over all the years. Now I'm going to start letting her ask me a couple questions.
I know what an important place Augsburg has always held in your life and still does. But I wondered, when did you first hear about Augsburg? When did it first become important to you?
Augsburg was something which I always knew about. I don't know when I learned how to read. I don't know when I first heard about Augsburg. It was just something that was a part of us. It was more than a school. It was more than a place. It was an institution. It was a feeling. It was a conviction. What kind of a home did I come from? Well, my father was a pastor. And as an immigrant from Norway, he came to Augsburg in January 1885. How did he know about Augsburg? Well, his uncle, Jacob Nygaard, had come to Wegdal to settle. And young Jacob caught the Amerika fever that characterized that island. 180 people a year moved off from that island until there were several thousand that had come to this country. So Uncle Jacob Nygaard had invited my father to come to this part of the country. He came in the fall of 1883. And during that winter, great-uncle Jacob Nygaard took father along to a meeting of the church group in Camperlee's congregation, which was outside of Montevideo, served by the then Pastor Nielsen Berg, the father of Dr. Luthard Berg and Miss Ingerberg. And during this time, my father said, I feel that I should go into the ministry. I would like to go to school in America. So Pastor Nielsen Berg said, write to Professor Georg Sverdrup in Minneapolis, Augsburg College, Augsburg Seminar as it was called then. So my father wrote, and he had a letter back from Sverdrup saying, it is a good thing if you can learn a little English before you come. So my father, a grown man of 23 years of age, sat in the little country schoolhouse and learned how to spell and read simple English. By Christmas time, he felt that he had enough background to start at Augsburg. And so in January 1885, he came on the Milwaukee train from Wegdal to Minneapolis. And he asked the station master, can you direct me to Augsburg Seminar? And the station master walked out on the sidewalk outside the Milwaukee depot, and he pointed to, do you see that building on the hill way out there outside of town to the east of us? Yes. Well, that is Augsburg. So my father, suitcase in hand, walked up those little streets, up across the Cedar Avenue, which then was a creek, and up the hillside up to Augsburg. My brother Harold, speaking about father, said he attended Augsburg. No, he joined Augsburg. And I think that he, together with many of the immigrants who were students at Augsburg, felt that Augsburg was their home. Over the years, I could always hear him speak about going home to Augsburg. Those men didn't have what they call a fraternity, as we know fraternities today. But there was a fraternity among them that was a very rich and deep and meaningful experience, which was something that we cherished over all the years of our lives. I can remember taking Reverend Johann Matzen past my father's room at the Ebenezer home when Father was very poorly and very ill, and the two men shook hands heartily and looked at each other with love and said nary a word, just på gensyn, Histopa, we'll meet again above. They said goodbye. It was the last time the two men saw each other. But words weren't necessary. They had lived through experiences together which bound them together into a fellowship, a brotherhood that was very, very deeply meaningful. Now, how did my father get to know my mother? That also is a beautiful little story. My mother's people came from Valdres, Norway. In 1884, a man with his family of sons and daughters emigrated from Norway, took 13 weeks on a little ship to New York, went by steamer up to Albany by that funny little wooden train across to Buffalo, on down to Chicago, and then on over to La Crosse, Wisconsin, being the second settler in Bostwick Valley. Grandfather took land in the hilly country there, and later when I visited Valdres, I could understand why they wanted to settle among the hills, because it made them think of their beautiful valley in Norway up in Valdres. High hills, trees, brooks, and running water, and full of fish in these little streams. Grandfather married at the age of 19 a woman who'd also come from Valdres. She was 7 years older than he. To this marriage were born 8 or 9 children, and my mother was one of these people who, in her early life, had the rare experience of going to country school with a college-trained teacher from Vermont. Her name was Miss Moran. Miss Moran was one of those people who somehow just captured my mother's interest. She wanted to excel. She wanted to read as well as she did. She wanted to speak as well as she did. She wanted to be able to do the things that an educated person can do. Miss Moran was also very fond of my mother, and I think found an apt pupil there. Probably it was through her influence, but anyway, my grandfather, way back in the 1860s and 70s, subscribed to the New York Times. And the New York Times came regularly to their home. I suppose it was a weekly at that time. I don't know. But my father came as a teacher, vacation Bible school teacher, as we call them now, to the congregation in North La Crosse. The pastor then was E.P. Harbo, the father of Leif and Alf and George Harbo and Mrs. Einar Andreas and Matilda. And he took father along out to this country parish, and they stayed overnight in this home. And my father promptly fell in love with this beautiful woman who was my mother. And 3 years later, they were married. Father loved to talk Norwegian, and Norwegian was a language that we used at home, but we also used English. And we learned, Mother corrected our English, and Father corrected our Norwegian. And we talked to Father in Norwegian, we talked to Mother in English. It was not hard to teach us how to read Norwegian. I can remember learning the alphabet in Norwegian when the Folkebladet newspaper came, our church paper. It was a big one at that time, and we would open it, and this I can remember from the time we lived in Mankato. And I was 3 years and 9 months old when we moved away from Mankato. But if there was a letter we didn't know, we would just turn to Mother and say, "What is that?" And so we learned our alphabet, and we learned how to read Norwegian, and our textbook was a Folkebladet. And if Ralph learned it, he was not quite 2 years older than I, then I wanted to learn it too. So I think we've always known how to read, and we always knew how to read Norwegian as well as English. I think, too, there were books of stories, and there were books of the folklore, and the Eventyr, the fairyland myths you see in all those stories from Norway that came into our home that we could enjoy. There were songs of the North, and there was the experience of a wonderful men's glee club in La Crosse, and all kinds of people that had come, because La Crosse got to be a crossroads of all the immigrants from the West. They came from Chicago through La Crosse. Many of them stopped, and then they spread out fan-like over all this whole great big Northwest. And so here there were many delightful and wonderful people, and it was a great, great Norwegian community until around the turn of the century. And then they sold out to Germans that came, and just huge areas of this valley were taken, the farms were sold to Germans, and they came in. But let me go back to a couple other remembrances from my mother's home. She was born in 1859, and she tells about the Civil War period. There were 3 girls first in this home, and they needed clothes, and gingham was unheard of, and calico sold for 90 to $1 a yard. And so grandmother took the muslin curtains from the windows in the house and made the necessary garments for these little girls. At that time, too, a man could hire somebody to go in his place in the service. And my grandfather, having a family of 5 children and aged parents to look after, and some other relatives, felt that he ought to do this. So he hired a man to go in his place into the service. Mother, talking about it once, said, "I saw my father cry twice. Once he came into the house and he said, 'Ingeborg, Abraham Lincoln has been shot.' And grandmother and my grandfather sat down and cried. And my mother, in her little child mind, wondered, what strange, I haven't heard about this relative that means so much to the folks. How haven't I heard about Abraham Lincoln?" And it wasn't until later that she was told that it was the President of the United States. But he meant that much to them that they just wept bitter tears because of this. And the other time she saw her father weep was when the man that my grandfather had hired to take his place in the war came home completely unscathed and in full health. In full health. And then there was a cry of joy, which was heightened when he told him that the last battle they were in, one of the other sharpshooters and this other man said, "Let's change places." They changed places, and that other sharpshooter was killed. So he had escaped miraculously to do this. We were brought up singing lots of the old Civil War songs, tending on the old campground. There had been a Sunday school by one of the men in this valley who had gathered many people together because it was the beginning of a Sunday school movement. This hadn't come to the Lutheran Church as such, but there was a Sunday school in this valley, and a Mr. Dudley brought all the young people together, and they had a Sunday school for younger children and older children. There was no organ in the church, and my grandmother and grandfather somehow had a little organ. And they would meet at our home, and they would practice the gospel songs as well as the chorales for the Lutheran Church in 4 parts so that they could sing in harmony when they were in church. Well, many years later, in 1934-35, while I was teaching in Hankow, China, the man who was in the consulate there had a little daughter going to the Hankow private school. And she loved to stop by and have the embassy car pick me up, and we would drive to school together in the mornings. And her mother was very much interested and came to visit us one Saturday morning. And my sister-in-law asked her where she had grown up, and she said, "Oh, it's a little town. I'm sure you never heard of it. It's in Wisconsin." Well, she said, "My husband served a church in Wisconsin. The name of the town is West Salem." "Oh," Petra said, We had to drive through West Salem to go out to Bell's Coulee to one of our congregations. And I asked her, what was your maiden name? And she said, Dudley. And I asked her, and she was so surprised at the question, did your grandfather have a Sunday school there for the people in the valley? Yes. Well, lo and behold, paths crossed again, and this was the granddaughter of that old man who had been my mother's Sunday school teacher. But this was an interesting blend of American language and the Norwegian language, of the American culture and the Scandinavian culture. And I think that my mother imbibed quite a good deal of this as she grew up, because she didn't want to be just one thing. She was always very proud of being an American and born in America. We children used to chide her once in a while when Father would say home in Norway, and she said, you shouldn't say home in Norway because your home is here. And then we said, but Mother, you say home in Wisconsin, back in La Crosse. But that was different because that was in this country. My father was ordained and went out to his first pastorate at Aberdeen, Washington. One little daughter was born to this marriage by the name of Agnes on the 15th of July, 1892, just a year after their marriage. And then my mother wasn't very well. The boom of people moving out was crushed by the panic of 1893, and all the lumber industry in Aberdeen and Hoquiam, Washington, where my father was a pastor, came to a standstill, and they decided that they would have to give this up because the congregation could no longer support them and come back to this part of the country. So naturally they went back to La Crosse and stayed there a while. Then my father was called to Mankato, Minnesota to be a pastor. And the second year, little Agnes died of what would be called spinal meningitis, I think, today. And the following year, my brother Ralph was born. I was born November 17th, 1895 in Mankato. The particular spot on which the house stood then is now a school ground, I suppose symbolic of the fact that I was going to be a lifelong school teacher. Who knows? Subsequently, my brother Harold was born some 3.5 years later, and when he was 6 weeks old, in the fall of 1899, my father moved with our family to Lamberton, Minnesota. During those years in La Crosse, or in Mankato, my father had been interested in following the pioneer settlers that came up the Minnesota Valley to Mankato, and from there they branched north and northwest. So he had followed enough people in the settlement around Lamberton, around Milroy, and around Lucan, Minnesota. In those three communities, Father organized congregations, and he felt he wanted to follow and be with the pioneer. Mother was much more interested in living in a city. But she said, after all, you are the pastor, you do this work, and where your work calls you and where you feel called to go, there I will go too. In Mankato, there was a widow with 3 children by the name of Crouch. And these children needed help. Somebody had gathered money to help them, and one pastor there wasn't very careful about the handling or husbanding these funds. So the upshot of the matter was that they brought the 3 children to my father and said, please do something about these children. And my father and mother talked this over, had the children in their home, and then Father thought this would be a good project for these 3 new congregations that he'd organized at Lamberton, Milroy, and Lucan to support a home for children. Subsequently, they built a home at Lamberton, and in this home there got to be some 15-20 children. Among the people who came to take care of these children were 2 deaconesses from the Deaconess Hospital and a mother house in Minneapolis. During the years that my father had been a student at Augsburg College and in the seminary, he had, among other things, taught a Bible class to the deaconesses once a week at the deaconess home. And his acquaintance with these people led him to get in contact with them and ask them to provide some sisters to look after this home for the children. So there was a sister Antoinette who came, and a sister Matilda, and a sister Carrie. Sister Antoinette resigned a few years later to marry a Mr. Batalden, a widower with adult children, and she lived on a farm home for many, many years. She's a mother of our Abner Batalden, who at present time is in Saigon and who has been a very active person in our church and at our college. Sister Matilda later married Reverend Gilseth of our church, and on our faculty at Augsburg is Dr. Carl Krislak, whose wife is Valborg Gilseth. His sister married a brother, Valborg, and another sister in nurse's training died a little later. And Carrie married a Mr. Nygaard, and we've had some of their children at Augsburg over the years. This children's home, Bethesda Homes, as it was called, the children's home at Lamberton, moved subsequently to near Wilmer, when the children in the home became of age when they should be able to do some work. They thought that living on a farm with cows and with animals and with farm work would be a very good thing. And so Bethesda Homes was moved to a farm about 5-6 miles outside of Wilmer, Minnesota, on Eagle Lake. Father, after having been a pastor at Lamberton for 6 years, was invited to come as a financial secretary for Augsburg. And in 1905, we moved to Minneapolis and lived there until the spring of 1908, during which time he, of course, traveled in all of the Lutheran Free Church congregations, went from home to home, and talked the cause of the church-related college and seminary and the importance of sending the young people there. The young men, I should say, because Augsburg was a men's school until it became coeducational in 1922. My childhood memories go back to the days at Mankato, and I can remember but faintly one H.N. Hendrickson, who came to teach vacation Bible school when I was a little girl. And when I came to Augsburg as a member of the faculty, he was the registrar and he was on our faculty. And we were great friends, although he was a man who, as a young seminary graduate, rocked me to sleep by singing me beautiful tenor solos. The friendship from his family and my father's family dated way back to Lamberton to Montevideo days, when my father had first come from Norway. There was a pastor, Erickson, who was a pastor at that congregation, who had been one of the first 3 graduates of Augsburg Seminary in Marshall, Wisconsin. The very first year that they started, 1869, and he was one of, 3 or 5 graduates in June of 1870. Did I say 1869 and 1870? He was called to this parish with no salary, but a place to work and an assurance from the people that he would never starve. These were pioneers living in sod huts in those days, and everybody would try to raise some cattle, some sheep, some pigs, some chickens, some grain, and out of whatever they had, they would bring to the parsonage some of these things. Now it happened that they had 3 sons and 2 daughters. I think there were 5 children at the time of this story, but one of my relatives, one of Father's people, one day Mrs. Blix was going to bake bread, and she thought, I think I should make a double batch of bread today, because maybe they need bread in the parsonage. And she gathered together some vegetables and things and thought, I'm going to send this over. And then Mr. Blix came in, and he said, I think maybe I should bring some vegetables, and I've butchered some. I think I should bring some of this meat over to the parsonage. So they loaded up the wagon with bread, with vegetables, with meat, with food. At the parsonage the evening before, the children had gone to bed hungry. And the parents had said to the children, and one of these sons of this pastor, who was a pastor, had related this incident to my brother Harold, that we went to bed, and we were all told that we should pray to God that we had no food. Just pray to God that He will send us food. So the next morning when these little children woke up, they were hungry. And they went downstairs, and there was nothing in the kitchen. And they went to their parents' bedroom, and they saw that the door was open, and their father and mother on their knees praying to God for food. And just then there was a rap at the kitchen door. And they went to the kitchen door, and there were these relatives of mine bringing food. God put it in our minds that you might need some food today. And so this man, a pastor himself then in his late years, said, you have no idea how this strengthened our faith in what prayer meant. Well, now these are some of the characteristic sort of ideas of faith and simplicity and so on, that people had a call from God to go out and to be messengers of love to the people who would come here from their homeland. And it was in this atmosphere that my father found himself at home and found himself in full sympathy with. And so it is no wonder that in his old age, the one last congregation he served, the pastor asked me, do you know what they call your father up here? And I said, no, the apostle of love. To which my brother Ralph said, well, when I was going to go away at school, Father took me aside and asked me some things and talked with me, and then he said, do you know what I think about when I wake up in the morning? Well, Ralph said, no, I just don't. Well, every morning when I wake, I think of who can I make happy today? And Ralph said, thereby hangs the whole philosophy of life. And so I know that my father's great pleasure was to bring happiness and joy to others. And then he was also the kind of person who could give it by, like Mary Lou once said, this niece of mine, Grandpa could accept a dozen eggs from a little lady to make her feel as though she were the Queen of Sheba. And this habit of being able to accept gifts with graciousness and with this is something that you live from the heart. It isn't anything that is put on. It's just simply inward there. Well, into this home of ours came these men then and their wives who had been a part of Augsburg's student body. And I can remember that as a child how thrilled we were that we knew Norwegian, because we could sit and listen to these delightful conversations. There were no telephones, there were no radios, there were very few newspapers, there were very few people that came, and my mother sometimes, being burdened with the cares of the household and all, not feeling too well, would say, oh, Jacob, why can't you have them stay someplace else? But oh no, they had to be there, and the conversations went on far into the night. Not about things, not about people, but about ideas and about the work of the kingdom of God and what they could do, because their whole life was somehow dedicated to the idea of serving this school, so that it in turn could serve the people. I know that when I was invited to come to Augsburg to be a teacher, I felt that part of my responsibility was to help confront every girl there with a personal commitment of life to the Christian way of life, which meant a surrender to Jesus Christ. And I tried over the years in many different kinds of ways to make this a reality. And there were some very rich and meaningful experiences. Oh, I know when I came, I thought, how in the world am I going to do this? And I read my Bible at night, and I wondered, how am I going to be able to so live, so talk, so work, that they can see that this is something that's mine and want it? Oh, I thought, too, when I came to Augsburg as a graduate from the University of Minnesota at the age of 26, if I were only older, if I only had gray hair, if I only had been married, so the girls would think, well, if I do what she says, well, then I, too, will probably be married someday. Well, time took care of the gray hair and the getting older, and the matter of being married or not, that somehow had gone by the way, because like Gertrude Hillebo at St. Olaf and I and many others of our generation never dreamed that we could be deans of women and be married at the same time. It was sort of a call to a commitment of life to that kind of service. I think I should pause for breath. I started my educational career when I was 7 years old by going to school at Lamberton, Minnesota. We lived on a farm home about 2 miles from town. My brother Ralph had gone with his Aunt Lottie, my mother's youngest sister, and her husband, Mr. Weimar, who was a teacher at Watertown College in Watertown, Wisconsin, and so took his first 2 years, the first year that he lived with them. He came back, a master of English and big vocabulary, and Gerda just tagged along with him all around and listened to everything and wanted to do just as much as he did. So in September that year, we carried our little lunch pails with us and walked off 2 miles to town. There was a shortcut we could take, which was a mile. But oftentimes the water was too high in the creek or the snow too deep on the road, so we'd walk around. So here was first grade. I can remember one thing about that teacher. A thunderstorm came up and I was a little frightened. She came and sat down the seat with me and put her arm around me and comforted me and somehow made me love her. She was married that following summer, and in the fall when school started, my pal of those years later told me that, let's go down and see Mrs. Gebhardt. I said, and if she could only have a baby, well, we could go wheeling the baby around. We didn't know too much about biology in those days. But my first year went on rather uneventfully, but I learned something in the second year. And last fall I was down and spoke, or last spring, spoke at Lambert, and I told the people in the congregation that I had learned 2 things there. And one lesson I learned when I was in 2nd grade. We had carried our lunch pails. I don't think any teachers used to stay during the noon hour. But I think that we had been some kind of goings-on at the school during the noon hour when no teachers were there. And when the teacher came back in the afternoon, teacher of my class, she said, "Now, Gerda, tell me what you did that was wrong." "You know it was wrong." And I said, "Well, what did I do?" She shut me up completely. And she said, "You stand in the corner there until you can tell me what you did that was wrong." And I started to ask, "What did I do?" And I said, "I don't." And she just wouldn't listen to me. "I don't know." I stood in my little blue sailor suit dress all afternoon. School started at 1 and wasn't over with until 4 o'clock. And the children looked at me standing there all afternoon. The sympathy was with me. And the teacher didn't do any explaining as to what I had done that was wrong. To this day, I don't know. I may well have done something wrong. But I asked her what it was. But this taught me, in all the years of my life, I wanted to give anybody a chance to say anything they wanted to say about what they had done. And I carried judgment didn't fail to pass judgment until I had felt that I had heard all sides of a story. This was probably a pretty valuable lesson to learn that early in life. But I have often wondered what it was that teacher accused me of and wouldn't tell me what it was so that I could get it rectified. That's, in one way, a very horrible kind of memory. But I can still feel the warmth and the affection of the children in the room. The teacher thought I was a stubborn mule. I guess maybe I was stubborn in some things, but I had nothing to confess, so that was that. And in the 3rd grade, one of my classmates fainted, and I thought, well, now wouldn't it be fun to be able to faint? Because she got a lot of attention, but I didn't. Then we had a summer. My mother was very ill and had to go to La Crosse for surgery. And I went along and lived in the hospital part of the time with her and stayed with a cousin. That following summer, we went out to Tacoma, Washington, where she had 3 sisters, one each to take care of each of us 3 children. And my grandmother was still living, so Mother stayed there. But we had a great summer, picnic baskets out to Point Defiance Park practically every day, living by the seashore, just having a wonderful, wonderful summer. It started the whole series in my life of vacations in Washington, which were always connected with mountains, with the ocean, and with fun. We moved to Lamberton. My father from Lamberton. We moved to Minneapolis. My father had been invited by Augsburg College to be what was called the traveling financial secretary. Father was a great person for personal contacts with people. He liked people. He liked to talk with people. He liked to talk the cause of Christian higher education with people. And he started a systematic covering of all of the congregations of the Lutheran Free Church. He visited in every home, and for years afterwards he could come to annual conferences, and he'd say, "Oh, hello, Mr. So-and-so." And he turned to Mother and said, "They live 2 miles north and 1 mile east from a certain church." But in those early days, too, gifts to the college were small sums and larger sums, mostly small sums. But the list of the people who had given money were given in the Folkebladet, in a list of gifts to the school. And lo and behold, didn't my father read those avidly? And of course he refreshed his memory about the people. But those that he'd gotten interested, he was always concerned about seeing how they were following up with these gifts. So this went on for 3 years. And meanwhile, we joined Trinity Lutheran Church, which was a college church and where all the students went to worship. There was a Sunday school. There were young people. There was a Norwegian young people's group and an English young people's group. And here were the Sverdrups and the Oftedals and the Blagens and the Hellans and the Harbos and all these wonderful people to be friends with. They had a custom to have open house on their birthdays. And the first time your birthday came around, and if you were new in the city, then you invited. So Mother and Father were duly invited to the birthday parties of the Sverdrups and the Oftedals, both Professor Sven Oftedal and Reverend Gustav Oftedal, to the Pedersens, to the Nydals, to the Hellands, and in turn had open house themselves. Both their birthdays were 10 days apart in January, but on the 19th they had open house for Father, and all these people came, and on the 29th of Mother. These were wonderful days because the people at Trinity Church had what they call Venemeter, friendship evenings, fellowship evenings. They'd get together just to listen to a program of good music, hear somebody talk, and then sit around and visit with each other. And oftentimes the floor was taken by one or the other of these leading thinkers from Augsburg College and Seminary. And so one could listen to the intelligent conversation of a Professor Georg Sverdrup, or have Professor Sven Oftedal tell about life in Greece, because he had gone to study there and he came back, and I can still remember one of the first set of slides that I had ever seen pictured in a church was a lecture on Greece given by Professor Sven Oftedal when I was 9 years old, and thinking, my, this man must be remarkable, who can speak a language that is as different as all of this. Well, I went to school at Seward School and skipped a half a grade, and then we moved a little closer to Augsburg, and I went to Monroe School. And Melvin Helland and I were in 6th grade, and we were given the choice of, after the first 15 minutes of mental arithmetic, if we got a 100, then we could go around and collect the absence slips from all the boxes at school. So we vied with each other, and both of us getting 100 every day, or we had a chance to alternate. But this is where all the children of the professors went to school, because they lived in houses on the block at that time, as we called it. There were the Pedersen children and the Nydal children and the Harbo children later, and the Evian children, all these people going to this little school. It was a great deal of fun. And then we had a wonderful Sunday school. Professor Nydal alternated with a Mr. Rasmussen, the Sunday school teacher. And needless to say, our Sunday school was all in Norwegian. And we sang songs out of a book called Sangbogen, which had been put together by one of the former teachers of Augsburg by the name of Ramestad and the then pastor at Trinity, M. Falk Gertsen. And those were the songs that we knew and loved and sang. But in these schools, I can remember in 6th grade at Monroe, we should have some home economics. And so we had 4 lessons before we moved away in March. The first lesson was how to sweep and dust the house. The second lesson was how to lay a fire at a stove. And the third was something about utensils and weights and measurements. And then we moved away, and the next recipe should be on how to make cream puffs and angel food cake. And I got one of the children to get me a copy and send them, but we moved to the country parsonage where we subsequently had chickens. And I made more angel food cakes and cream puffs the next 5-6 years than I've ever made all the rest of my life, following those recipes. From Minneapolis, my father had a strange experience of during these years of losing Professor Georg Sverdrup as president of Augsburg, who was succeeded by his colleague Sven Oftedal. The Depression years of 1907, with its small panic, came. Oftedal was like a man without a tie, because he and Sverdrup had been such intimate friends that he was completely lost without him. And with the financial situation being tight and difficult, and Father's plan of long-range solicitation of friends and building up friendships, Oftedal thought he could do better, I guess, himself going out